Hello and good evening and welcome to the next installment of Burma Week. And I've been looking forward to this one because it's a good old battle exploration understanding, which I kind of like. So we are in 1945 this time. We've had some great talks so far. James Holland was, of course, brilliant. Richard Duckett talking about the SOE. And I think anyone who watched the Chindits show last night were moved by Tony Redding's incredibly emotive connections with the fighting there and some of the things his father witnessed and the people he interviewed. That was really, really powerful stuff. But tonight, Lucy Betteridge-Dyson is joining us to talk about Commandos and Hill 170. So I've been excited about this one. So how are you doing?
I'm good. Yeah, and thanks for having me.
Well, thanks for being here. And of course, talking about personal connections with Tony, your grandfather was out there. So I'm guessing that's where your first interest in this came from, is that personal family connection. So tell us about him.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's just so often the case with military history, isn't it? You kind of get into it through family connections. My grandfather, Ted Sims, he was a 4-4 commando, and he was really active in the commando veteran community. And I was lucky enough to go to a couple of meets with him. And yeah, my interest just kind of stemmed from that, really. I wanted to know what he did, and what it was like for him. And then, when he passed away, it was only after and that I really dug into things and got into military history. And one of those things, isn't it? You always wish you'd asked the questions when you had the opportunity.
Yeah, I mean, I'm obviously a bit older than you, and World War II veterans. When I was a kid, they were so common. I didn't think about asking them because they were just everywhere. And then now, God, why didn't I speak to the guy? First guy who trained me was a football coach, was a World War II veteran. So, I think, why didn't I go back? But anyway, we're here to talk about Burma. So set the scene for us. We've got your PowerPoint about where we are by the time we get to early 1945. We're well back. We're on the offensive foot now. At that stage of the Burma campaign, that the horrors of 1942 and being pushed out are long in the past now. We've got, things are working our way. So we've got your PowerPoint. So set the scene for us. And when we get comments from YouTube, I'll jump in and ask them and I'll hand over to you, really.
Cool. Yeah. So I'm guessing, like a lot of people, obviously, hopefully have watched the other shows this week and have a broad understanding of what was going on in the war in Burma. I know there's also going to be a few people watching tonight that maybe don't. And historically, it was really viewed as an outpost for the defence of India, which was, the jewel in the British Empire's crown. And it was thought of as being pretty impenetrable in places, and it certainly is. But I think that was overestimated. And if you pop over to the next slide, there's I know it's kind of obvious here, but we really want to understand the jungle conditions in the Arakan region, really thick, mountainous as well. And obviously following kind of 1943, the formation of the 14th Army, at this point in time, an attempt to take the Arakan region failed disastrously, really, for the British. There was a lack of training, a lack of expertise. It was rushed and it was defeated. And in 44, Slim commenced with the British forces again the undertaking of a limited offensive to in the Arakan, which was much more successful. And it took the Allies across the Irrawaddy River. And all of this kind of brings us to early 1945, late 44, and the beginning of what would sometimes be known as the Third Arakan Campaign. And that's where we're kicking off, really.
Yeah, and I think we just to touch on what we've done in the previous shows, it's during the process leading up to this, the British Army had come, and the Commonwealth Army and all the people that make it up had come from being, in a sense, scared of the jungle to being masters of it. We had to overcome those initial difficulties. The cliche, but it's a true cliche, the Japanese being a master of jungle warfare and become masters ourselves. And so it's a very different army. It's very differently led. It's very differently equipped. It's very different in its makeup, but it's certainly now kind of trying to come to terms with this terrain and make the best of it and learn from those mistakes. And as we said with James Holland, it's a theatre where actually I think the learning curve was pretty steep when you take into consider the time lost to monsoons and this, that, and the other. And we must touch on, and I'll hand it back to you, the fact it's always kind of the bottom of the chain in terms of supplies and updated equipment. Burma kind of is bottom of everybody's list in some ways, understandably. So so anyway, the jungle there is something that we can't relate to, and the difficulty of the terrain. But by this point of the war, things are a bit better for us with getting to where we can understand it now. So
yeah, I think you put that really well, Paul. And I think, actually, when we're looking at tonight, I'm going to be focusing on 3 Commando Brigade. And when you look at the Commando Depot and the training at Macquarie, there was no jungle training whatsoever. So, this was the guys were being prepared really for war in Europe. So by the time that they go out to India in 43, they had to be trained up out there. And it was kind of put together piecemeal, really, a lot of it. And the same goes for the kit that they were using. It was nowhere near as advanced. It was the tatty old stuff. And that did have an impact, and I think makes the story of Hill 170 and what was achieved even more kind of remarkable, really. If you pop on to the next slide. Can't obviously do any kind of presentation or talk about Burma without getting a pic of Slim in. I'm sure he's been name checked in pretty much every talk this week. I'd be surprised if he hadn't.
I think so, yeah.
And I think the thing that I want to mention tonight is, even though I'm going to be focusing on 3 Commando Brigade, the 14th Army was one of the most diverse armies in history. There were over 40 languages were spoken. All the world's major religions were represented, and that was really, really important, actually, I think, to this action. We've got the West Africans and obviously the Indian Army as well play a huge role in this. And basically, where we end up, we've had Imphal, we've had Kohima, and these are battles that everybody is very familiar with. But what was next? What were they to do now that the Japanese were on the back foot? And if you move over to the next slide, we can have a look at the man in charge and where we're going to be. So for the Japanese, the Arakan coast was an important area for communication lines. It was important for the Allies because they needed to gain control of the port and the airfield on Ramri and Akyab Island, which were you can see labelled in that map there. But the objective really was to outflank the retreating 54th Division of the Japanese 28th Army, block its route through the Arakan Peninsula as it sought to escape via the waterways, the chungs there, out to the sea. And also, the major thing was to block the road to Rangoon, so block their escape route inland. And this task was given to Lieutenant General Christison's 15th Indian Corps, Christie, as he was known. He proposed to use the newly formed 3rd Special Service Brigade, later renamed 3 Commando Brigade, to avoid the initials SS, which had obviously developed fairly unpleasant connotations. And they were going to be using a series of amphibious landings to spearhead an invasion of the Arakan by sea. Together with 4 divisions of the 25th, 26th Indian and 81st and 82nd West African, plus support from 224 Group RAF and a naval task force. This would be a really, really fierce and challenging combined operation that was planned pretty ad hoc, I have to say.
And just to reinforce the idea as well, Lucy, about the road links. I mean, we talk about any campaign. You can look at Italy, you can look at Normandy, and transport hubs, things like that are vital. But in Burma, there's so few that they become absolutely the entire focus, either for moving your own army forwards or for retreating your army backwards, and therefore the rivers as well, and therefore the bridges, as Richard Duckett talked about with the SOE, and the importance of knocking out a few bridges and sealing people in certain areas. I mean, it is the theatre where there is the least ways of moving through it with a large force, isn't it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think, blocking that road off, that was the essential thing, because, as you say, it was really one of the only routes for them to escape. And the other thing to remember, as you said before, is obviously the Japanese were much more familiar with the Burmese landscape by 44, 45. Yes, that we'd learned a lot of lessons, and the Allies had learned to deal with the conditions a lot more, but still, reconnaissance wasn't easy in these parts. And, getting to understand what was going on in Myebon, the routes of the chungs, they all crisscrossed over, knowing those routes, that's like detailed local knowledge. And that was going to be pretty challenging, and certainly supplying the troops, but also just kind of operating and achieving objectives at all. You kind of going in quite blind to things. if you pop over to the next slide, Paul, obviously I got to get this in here just for my granddad. So yeah, I'm going to be focusing on 3 Commando Brigade, but they weren't, these were spearheading the assault. They weren't the only troops fighting there. I kind of want to make that clear, because I think, the Indian divisions often get forgotten in the wider conversations about the Second World War. Obviously in Burma there was such a major importance. But 3 Commando Brigades comprised of number 1 and number 5 Army Commando, and 4-2 and 4-4 Royal Marine Commando, and they were commanded by Brigadier Campbell Hardy, and they would distinguish themselves really as the only commando brigade to serve in the Far East. As tough as the training had been at Akyab, as I said, there was no jungle training provided there, and when they arrived in India in 43, they needed to do some pretty quick in the deep end training to get used to the jungle conditions, the heat, the disease, all of that. They were learning from scratch when they were out, in the field. And it was a shock to the system, really, as you can imagine.
Yeah, and something that we went through with Tony Redding yesterday, just that everything in that environment is trying to kill you. The enemy, the insects, the animals, the wildlife, the climate, and disease, and that's not to belittle the experience of the commandos in the ETO, but it's this area of the world is very, very difficult, and still is very difficult. And as James made the point, it's still whole areas, I mean, particularly now with the political situation, that you just can't get to and no one goes to. And yeah, so it's takes a lot of time to acclimatize troops for that type of environment.
It does, definitely. And as you mentioned as well, the landing craft, the kit was all in pretty bad shape. So they were working, in tough conditions before the battle even started, before the operation even began. Yeah. So the commandos would land on the Myebon Peninsula, and they would establish a beachhead, advance on foot to the villages of Myebon and Kangaw, and secure the area for the main forces' arrival. But before this assault, they needed to secure the small island of Akyab, which the Japanese had been using as an airbase, and that was Operation Talon. So Akyab was garrisoned by 3 Japanese battalions, but the unexpected advance of the West Africans in the Kaladan Valley caused Miyazaki, the commander of the Japanese 54th Division, to withdraw 2 battalions to meet that threat, leaving just 1 battalion on Akyab. The last of the 3 battalions pulled out literally 2 days before the British landed on Akyab. But all of this was a surprise, really, to the British. Intelligence was limited. They thought that Akyab was still going to be occupied by Japanese forces. So at 4 in the morning on the 3rd of January 1945, when they're sailing down the Arakan coast, they're thinking, right, we're going to prepare for a reasonably big assault here. And when the motor launch alongside them announced that actually the Japanese had already left the island, the news was met with what one commando described as an almost suburban lack of emotion, which I've always really enjoyed that phrase. So dropping anchor, they embarked on their landing crafts, landed on the beaches at the northern end of the island, and marched to the village of Don Yen. And it was such a non-event that there's a chap from one commando, his overriding memory of the landing was just eating a tin of pineapples. So it turned out to be not a thing. So when they got to the island and secured the airbase, and they basically spent time patrolling the area, trying to gather more intel, getting to know the villagers, to gather local information. That was a big thing. And they journeyed out to small jungle-covered islands that dotted around the area. So I guess it's quite hard to imagine, but this is like a spray of tiny little islands, and each have got their own, inhabitants living there. And they didn't know what they were going to be facing. They didn't know whether the Japanese were still going to be on these little islands. So they went in, did these patrols. They were cautiously welcomed by the villagers. They had nothing to report about the Japanese, although they were kind of keen to help, but they were deeply fearful of retribution. And, I guess a word about the Japanese, even though they were on the back foot, they were still a ferocious and highly courageous force, who fought very much on their own terms, on a completely different doctrine. And I don't know, I guess this is something that you can't escape when you're talking about the war in Burma, but this is fighting an ideology as much as anything else with this enemy. doctrine was based on the Bushido warrior code, so they were strictly disciplined. They demanded absolute loyalty from their soldiers, and it was a soldier's duty to endure death rather than surrender. So fighting in kind of shadowy dugouts, silent flanking maneuvers, all of this really going to add to the complexity for the newly arrived commandos, essentially.
Yeah, and I'm glad you made that point, because when we had Iwo Jima week last month, for people who study the ETO primarily, understanding the fanaticism and the lengths the Japanese will go to. And it's not that you're judging them in the sense, we're just saying you have to accept that's how it was. And it means the fighting became of a certain nature, and everything is elevated, emotions, and it's just understanding that is what you're dealing with here. And it's not very nice at times, and that's an understatement. But that's it. That's the world. That's the enemy we were facing there. And again, the fear of the locals, these people on the islands there, who don't necessarily want to show their hand, because they would have all had a reputation of the Japanese as being savage and exacting revenge and punishment. And the British know we're a liberating force coming for good, quote unquote, but your average person there doesn't know that the invading army is going to be any different to the army that's just left.
Yeah, definitely. And I think the civilian population in Burma is something that gets overlooked. I think there's more to be learnt there from their views and their experiences in the war. But as you said, it's just about understanding the playing field, right? It's not about judging, but it's knowing what you're facing and accepting that, and looking at the impact that had on how operations transpired, basically, and what happened, because it does inject an element of fear and, all those unwritten rules of combat, so to speak, that you might be used to are changed, or, you find your enemy is actually playing by a different rule book, and that's going to affect things psychologically and tactically. And if you pop over to the next slide, Paul, there's just a picture just to really show the Akyab experience. Just that, So it's kind of a bit of an anticlimax, which, yes, is a relief on one hand. On the other hand, not ideal, I guess, when you're kicking off, because you then got to build up again. You then got to kind of rearrange, reassess. The next phase in the operation would be Operation Passport. So this is the landings on the Myebon Peninsula, and I've got a map on the next slide, which I found recently. Actually, there's really good maps. A couple of them I found in old war magazine. So 30 miles southeast of Akyab is this the Myebon Peninsula. It's narrow, it's very hilly, and it's sandwiched between two rivers, the Katsin and Myebon rivers. And the peninsula is densely covered with jungle, with bamboo, but capturing it was essential to Christie's plan, because, as I mentioned, the Allies needed to gain control of these main waterways, including the Dangbong Chung, which you can see on the right. And this would, deny the Japanese escape routes out to the sea, and also take control of communication, supply lines, and that kind of thing. In addition, Myebon really is going to provide the foothold into the Arakan region in order for the Allies to launch the main attack on Kangaw and cut off that escape route that we were talking about into the Burmese interior. But this is uncharted, unpredictable territory. The beaches at Myebon they're not really beaches. Calling them beaches, you kind of think of maybe Normandy, Paul, but we're talking kind of really small interspersed areas of sand and mud, and it's surrounded by hills, more than like 1,000 foot above sea level. And there was little known about how Miyazaki had ordered the 54th Division to defend the area. At this point, we're like 4 days until D-Day, until the landings. So preparations had to be made very hastily. Aerial reconnaissance provided some help, but it was limited. But it did reveal that there was beach defences, so they were covered in bamboo stakes, which obviously would be strong enough to withstand a bow door opening. So there was limited information, but 3 Commando Brigade were tasked with spearheading the assault, land on the tip of the peninsula, secure Myebon village and its jetty, and that was all going to go on the 12th of January, and it would follow a naval and air bombardment. So we had squadrons from 224 Group RAF strafing the landing areas. We had sloops that were supporting naval bombardment, which was, absolutely essential in this. And timing was the crucial thing here, because the beaches where they were due to land were covered in this thick black mud and sand, and it was going to make landing absolutely impossible at low tide. Next slide, please.
Yeah, and just we've got a question from Scott Grimwood while we're preparing, who's regular viewer.
Yeah.
The Japanese aren't defending the same way that they would be defending the Pacific Islands. I'm guessing the main thing about the islands, when we're going back to Peleliu and Taro and Iwo Jima, is there is no means of getting their troops out. So the Japanese policy, broadly speaking, was defend the last man, and that's it. But in Burma, of course, and that's why you've been emphasizing these rivers, and there is a sense of the Japanese. It's engage, fall back, engage, fall back, engage. So they're fighting with the same fanaticism, I'm assuming, but their overall aims are very different. Is that fair to say?
I think that's fair. Look, they were keen to defend Kangaw. That was what they wanted to protect at all costs, because of that road, because of that juncture that it sits on. Myebon obviously is kind of, there's nothing essential going on there, but it's kind of on the route to Kangaw. So they weren't just going to give it up easily, but at the same time fall back, strengthen defenses around Kangaw. So yeah, it was not the same kind of level of do or die on the peninsula. So this map here, it just gives you a bit more detail really of what we're talking about, and we've got some of the landing beaches named on there. As I said, there were defenses on the beaches. They were mined, and they had these bamboo stakes. So the Japanese had undertaken some preparations here, and on the evening of the 11th of Jan, number 1 combined operations pilotage party, who were a specialist unit, they were entrusted with surveying the landing sites in a bit more detail and covertly clearing them. So as they approached in canoes, they found that the bamboo stakes that the air reconnaissance had found were actually barnacle encrusted teak, some of which were like a foot in diameter. So these are big defenses. They've been there a while. So these guys came in canoes in the darkness to lay some delayed charges there, and after a false start in the first detonation, which didn't work properly, finally they got it detonated around about 20 to 7 in the morning of the 12th, and the first wave of men from 4-2 Commando were able to push on to the beaches. So at the moment then we're looking at the air support coming in strong, so ripping up the sand, and as Commando boots hit the ground here, shielded smokescreen, and the Japanese were taken by surprise somewhat. They scrambled to defend the beachhead. As you say, they was fairly lightly defended, but still, they were at fire from, like 6 75mm, 2 35mm, and 1 captured 2-pounder gun there. So the commandos are coming under fire. Jed Allen, one of the veterans from 4-2, was disembarking his landing craft. Tremendous bang rocked the craft, and he's there yelling, "I'm hit, I'm hit," before he realized that all the blood covering him is actually from the Marine in front of him, who's had his head clean taken off. So they're coming under horrific fire in horrendous conditions, trying to make this landing. Though the beach was mined and several more men were killed and wounded, actually the landing was a reasonable success. 4-2 managed to get a foothold, secure the beachhead, and 5 Commando followed in. And that was the first wave in. And if you head on to the next slide, there's a photo here of the Marines coming into shore. This is from the second wave, and actually, unfortunately for the men in the second wave, 4-2 and 1 4-4 and 1 Commando, the landing didn't go as smoothly and as straightforward. So there was a signalling mistake, a 3-hour wait in between the waves, which wasn't meant to happen, and they were meant to land on an adjacent beach just further up, and in the end they came on the same course as the first wave, which basically resulted in them landing at low tide, which was the exact thing that they were trying to avoid doing. And the men stepped out, and they are in this thick, gluttonous black mud that was just horrendous, waist high. And one of the Marines said, if Pharaoh could have seen us, he would have thought the Red Sea landing was mighty cushy. Wow. And so, yeah, it's like a sticky quicksand, basically. And it made it absolutely impossible to keep the kit dry, absolutely impossible to move forward in, even like we're talking to the extent it was sucking the boots and socks off of the blokes here.
Wow.
Yeah, they struggled to stand. They all struggled to move. And the only way they could move forward, they're still coming under fire from the Japanese. There's still a couple of guns that haven't been captured, even though we've got 4, 2, and 5 Commando. There's fire coming in from behind the beaches. So they're struggling to stand. They're having to resort to these rugby scrums to get through the morass and get onto land. Mortars, Brens, they were going under, getting sucked up in this mud. Everything's covered. When they finally reached dry land, there was nothing that hadn't been touched by this mud, and they're absolutely exhausted. And really, it's only the perseverance, that mental strength of mind and the fitness that they had in their training in that Macquarie, that really prevented this from becoming a fatal landing just by want of the conditions.
Yeah, and just I want to emphasize the point. You said they missed the intended beach a bit. And again, those are people who've studied watching this, who've studied things like Anzio or Normandy or whatever. Just recognizing features. You're pushing in a landing craft. When the jungle is changing minute by minute because things grow so fast. It's sure they've got maps, sure they've got aerial photos, but it's not like you've got your church towers and those kind of things that you have in other battles. Again, it's this emphasis of it being a very much an alien environment. I know the shape of the coast was very distinctive there, but that's kind of at a larger level. When you're right in close, is this the right place? Is that the wrong place? I mean, it seems hard to imagine how little information these commanders would have had about what's ahead of them compared to other battles in other parts of the war.
Yeah, absolutely. This is literally uncharted territory,
Yeah.
And as
no
you say,
hyperbole in this case.
Yeah, absolutely. And as you say, you've got no buildings or anything to refer to. You just got trees and beaches and the tide which moves in and out so quickly. So, I guess it was not unexpected that this might happen. So meanwhile, anyway, they finally all get onto the land. They secure the beach, the surrounding areas, and at the same time, we've got some Sherman tanks from the 19th Lancers. They're coming ashore. They were also thwarted by the same problem, so they had to land further west than originally intended. So the whole getting everybody actually onto the peninsula is complex in the first place, not because of the enemy necessarily, but because of the conditions that they're facing. So after Myebon village is secured, the Marines boxed in for a cold and pretty unpleasant night. And boxing in, I don't know if this has been covered in the talk so far, but this was they formed like a tight tripwire line square basically, and you had your overlapping machine guns on each corner. I think it's like fairly unique to Burma really to try and avoid encirclement tactics, which the Japanese really favoured because they didn't know, there's lack of visibility here. They don't really know what they're facing still. And if you move on to the next slide.
And that's, just to emphasize again that point, that's that as James Holland said, is that in this theatre, your enemy, you're going to be engaging them at 20 yards, not 200 yards. That everything's close, and so it's more like kind of circling the wagons in the American West kind of situation, whereas more like not like in a traditional defense. It's very much adapted to the exact conditions they're facing, which is your enemy can be upon you before you know they're there. And for some reason, I'm thinking of the Arnold Schwarzenegger in Predator right now. I don't know. It came into my head there in an abstract kind of way. I'll hand back to you.
It's kind of the point. This picture here is it's actually from the previous Arakan campaign, because actually photos from the third Arakan are very, very few and far between. Yeah, very hard to find. But just for illustrative purposes, just to show you some of the conditions here. So for Commando, they were awoken during the night by fire from a Japanese 75mm. So as you said, they don't know who is where, and you can't get a clear viewpoint here because you're in the middle of the jungle. And it turns out that this Japanese gun emplacement was there. They were alerted to the commander's location by the noise of their braying mules. I've got to get a mention of mules in there somewhere. It's my other passion. But fortunately, the rounds fell short. No one was wounded, and soon, basically what you had was the commandos were leapfrogging each other to move up through the Myebon Peninsula. They're capturing these little areas of high ground, so these little features, because it's a hilly area, and in between and behind each, who knows what's going to be there. So they're having to capture each one. It's slow progress, and the leapfrogging went on for about a week, advancing up the peninsula. Rations by this point are getting low, hard to supply in these conditions, so food became a priority. And the men at this point, they're facing to the jungle conditions, the psychological strain I get of not knowing what's ahead, having really limited intel on the areas, and planning for the next objective, which at this point was to capture the village of Kantar, which sits at the top of the Myebon Peninsula, and it's a large area of high ground essentially. And the advance up to Kantar was perilous. It was horrible. They were going through these thick jungle tracks, having to work their way through these little paths, mangrove swamps, and the threat of Japanese snipers. And I remember, my grandfather told me stories of the Japanese tying themselves to branches in trees, sniping down, and you're shooting up. You don't necessarily know who you're shooting at, if you've killed someone, if you haven't. So all this kind of, I guess, the psychological strain adds to the stress of it all. So reaching to the top of the peninsula, and by the 20th of January, they were preparing for the next major operation, which was going to be the attack on Kangaw and another amphibious landing. But it's not going to be from the sea. Instead, they're going to sail up the Dangbong Chung, one of those main waterways, and they're going to launch their attack from there. And the Japanese force in the Arakan's about 5,000, I guess, at this point, and they're retreating south. Again, because the intel is limited, the Allies don't necessarily know how many troops they're expecting to face, but they know that Kangaw is going to be heavily defended because it's such an important place. So it was here basically that Christie had planned to cut off what was their last remaining escape route.
Just to interject for a second, to remind our American viewers, we didn't necessarily break down the sizes of a commando unit. So I mean, perhaps us British are more familiar, but what sort of size force are we talking about in total?
Well, it's interesting because really they weren't large, and I was listening to some veteran accounts just recently, and the commandos were saying that one of these chaps was saying that he felt really bitter about the whole operation because he felt they were being used to cover the work of a much larger force. And I don't know what the American sizes are.
No, but I mean, yeah, just because a commando troop is different. Infantry regiments are 2,400. American Army, a battalion is about 900, maybe 1,000 some units. So we're and the Rangers is more similar to the commando. So a Ranger, I think a Ranger company is about 140, if my memory serves me correctly. So comparatively, the commandos, a commando troop is how many again? Remind me, my brain's just failed me.
I don't know actually.
Yeah, no, I've my brain's, but the whole force is hundreds, not thousands, isn't it?
Yeah, it's hundreds. Yeah, the troops are, I would say like 40, 50, something like that. So the whole force is in total, it's not massive, and I think that's the key thing here. We're not talking about whole regiments landing and this kind of massive force. That wouldn't work in any case here because of the terrain that they're covering. They needed to be small, but then the problem with that is by the time you get there, unless the infantry have caught up with you, unless the main force has caught up with you, you're standing alone against a much larger enemy. And that was basically what happened with 3 Commando Brigade here. So the 51st Indian Infantry Brigade, they were due to follow. They were following up to Kangaw. Took them much longer to arrive. So let's have a quick look what slide we're on now. Just have a look. Yeah. So okay. So we are preparing for the Dangbong Chung amphibious landing here.
Yep.
this photo is actually from a return to Burma that my grandfather went on, actually. I think it was for the 60th anniversary. And it was lovely to see actually all the veterans almost, I mean, they went actually up to Hill 170, which is amazing considering their age, but just gives you an idea of the waterways that we're talking about here. They're not massive wide areas. There's lots of different sizes, but the Dangbong Chong was one of the biggest. And the Christie's plan was to get the commandos to land on this on the beach. I say beaches again, they're mangrove swamps, to get up from the Chong, fight through the mountainous regions and get to Kangaw. So the idea was they had to get there before Japanese reinforcements arrived at Kangaw. They land in this muddy, kind of horrendous conditions. Again, the three defended hills that were there, Pinner, Milford and Brighton. I'm just thinking if you move on to the next slide, there's a map. Just to put it in a bit more context for people.
I did this research while they're talking, and Colin Taylor says it's 75 to a troop, 450 to a brigade, but that's at full strength.
That's at full strength.
And in this environment, there's malaria, there's people coming down with crap all the time. So that's a theoretical figure. Probably very, very rarely was it ever achieved. Yeah,
I think that. Yeah, and thanks, Colin, for those figures. So we've got three. I don't know if you can zoom in here, Paul, but if we look to the bottom left, you should see Thames Beach. This was one of the landing areas on the Chong, so you can see they're kind of coming off, and then Hove Beach, which is a little further along, is on another tiny little stream off of the Dangbong Chong. And you've got these three big features: Pinner, Milford and Brighton. Brighton is Hill 170, and as you mentioned, this is a war fought on three fronts, really. They're facing not just the Japanese, the jungle, which is incredibly thick in this part, and the climate and the disease. So on the 22nd of January, then, you've got this 50-vessel convoy. They're heading up the Dangbong Chong towards Thames Beach, which you can see here. And at 12:45 in the afternoon, one commando lead the assault under enemy shelling. So as soon as they hit the beaches, the Japanese open up, and they're coming out of their landing crafts, which into kind of like tangled roots of mangrove swamps. So again, they're up to their waists in water, and they had nowhere to dig in. So an immediate and aggressive attack on Hill 170 was pretty much the only option. Supported again by naval bombardment, which was invaluable at this point. They were able to neutralize some of the Japanese guns here. 4-4 advanced later in the afternoon, consolidated the southern side of Brighton 170, which had been cleared by one commando, at a cost of, I think there was 3 dead, 9 wounded. So reasonably light casualties, but they're really starting to get into the thick of it here. And that night, so they've got the south side of Brighton. That night, 3 troops of 4-4 move off. They cross open paddy fields, which separate these hills, to capture Milford. They get there. It's unopposed. Great. Bit unnerving, if I'm honest, at this point. They're feeling a bit unnerving with what's going on. At 170, the Japanese launched this fierce probing counterattack, and it was small. It was a small attack, but it was obviously to gauge the strengths, understand what's going on. An officer drew his sword, signaled a charge, and an small enemy party ran at the commandos full pace, howling as they did so, trying to unnerve the commandos. And this happened 2 or 3 times throughout the night. 2 or 3 times it was repulsed. A couple more fatalities, but it was a long night here and very unnerving. Commandos again boxed in, and just focusing on 4-4 commando for a moment. You have to indulge me just because it's my granddad's one.
Absolutely, yeah.
Shortly after daybreak on the 23rd, the C Troop of 4-4, they advanced to the next objective, and that was Pinner, a really steep jungle-covered hill. And this is close to the Kangaw Road. And what they're doing here is they're trying to gain this bit of high ground to see what's going on, to try and recce, find out what's happening towards the road side of things. They find that no enemy is present again. So again, this is close to Kangaw. There's no one to be seen. Unbeknownst to them at this point, the afternoon of the 23rd is going to be the calm before the storm. Objective was in sight. the commandos believed by this point they'd caught the Japanese unaware, that their speed had somehow, knocked them for six. They were finding carefully concealed artillery positions that had been dug like deep into the banking that had been pretty hastily abandoned. But if we move on to the next slide, I think we've got another map going on. Yeah, so again, this is just illustrative. This is not of Hill 170. It's of earlier in the second Arakan, I think. But this is just to give an idea of what the landscape was like. And these hills, they're very steep. They're not like little tiny hills we sometimes in the First World War when we're talking about hills on a Somme,
Little bumps.
Exactly. So at this point, the Marines, they're looking across the Kangaw. They can see the heights at which the Japanese are defending this road. But it was all pretty lifeless. Then at 8 p.m, bright moon, enemy artillery ranged in on Pinner, and pretty much all hell broke loose, and mortar fire opened up on 4-4's northern flank. The Japanese basically had been carefully following the brigade's movement since they landed, and far from surprised, they were well aware of their positions. Several men were wounded, and then again, silence returned. So you've got this very stop and start tactics from the Japanese, which I don't know if you kind of come across or spoken about before this week, but it's not like, when we think about, some of in the European theatres where it's kind of, right, you're in the battle and it's going on. It's a totally different ball game here, and it's unnerving. And I think that's the key thing here. We're talking about psychological war as much as anything else.
Yeah, and the Japanese were good at that, weren't they? That whole thing that you see, the cliche from the war film was of pretending to be wounded Americans and calling out names. They're doing things that I guess the British and Americans would think of 30 years later, but they're very good at trying to freak the hell out of people, aren't they? Whereas the British are maybe more going into the conventional way of warfare. The Japanese are we've got maybe combined arms in terms of air power and navy. They've got combined arms in the sense of using this fear factor, this like the use of swords and these nighttime infiltration things. It's going to put the fear of God in you, and that they were good at doing that, and they knew they were good at doing that. The Japanese have been doing that by this point for 5 years. So worth stopping and addressing how they were masters of that kind of just freaking the hell out of people.
Absolutely, and that's something that comes through a lot when we're looking at veteran testimony of this action in particular. They pretty much every tactic you've just mentioned there, they used, and so during this night, they're telling these small parties in, and then they're stopping. So, you're kind of like, right, what's going on? It's pitch black. You can't see anything around you, just, the thick foliage of the jungle. And all you've really got is your hearing at this point. So it all goes quiet again, and, the commandos can hear rustling, and they can hear the braying of mules. So they can hear that the Japanese are advancing from the Kangaw Road, but they can't see them. They don't know when they're going to attack, when they're not going to attack. They can't leave their positions, really. They're just waiting. Suddenly, a red very light shoots up, and from this pitch darkness, the Japanese launch a much stronger and far more vicious counterattack. Machine gun fire swept the forward trenches. Artillery from the paddy fields blasted the Marines at pretty much point blank range. They were incredibly close. The noise was deafening, and soon the whole area is thick with smoke. So it's nighttime, you're in the jungle, you've got smoke everywhere, you've suddenly got all this noise at much closer proximity than you saw. And the first infantry attack from the Japanese hit very quickly, and they were frantically advancing through their own fire, through their own shelling. Trees were splintering. And the Marines guarding the forward slope were killed by an enemy who knew the terrain exceedingly well, even in the darkness. And while this is all going on, the Japanese were also quietly advancing on the flanks of the commandos. This, wasn't really a surprise. I think they were aware of these tactics. It's one of those things, though, that you could be aware of something, but when you're in the middle of it, there's only so much you can do to prepare yourself psychologically for it. So that's basically all the commanders can do is wait. They can hold their nerve and wait to the last minute when the Japanese will attack. And at that point, the commandos open fire. They're firing into the darkness. They can't see really what's going on. And there's this fierce hand-to-hand fighting before the attack was repulsed. And this happened pretty much relentlessly throughout the night. And as you mentioned earlier, Paul, in between the attacks, the Japanese are calling out in English, "Johnny, I'm wounded," and they're trying to attract medical attention. They're trying to pull the guys from their positions just so they can, pull a pin on a grenade when they get nearby in these kind of suicidal attacks. But, the commandos were disciplined, and, they did very, very well to resist this, to wait until the last minute. And that's really, though outnumbered, the way that they were able to repel these attacks time and time again. So I think there were around about 80 casualties, more hand-to-hand fighting, but the only intruder into the the trenches was a porcupine who staggered alongside the RSM and expelled all his quills into him. So yeah,
it was only the RSM. It's not like they're needed.
Exactly.
Yeah, God.
So after one last attack, the voice called out from the Japanese side, "We'll be back in the morning," and at daybreak, a bombardment began again. So there was a short interlude during the night, but we had more shelling in the morning. But this turned out to be a bit of didn't turn out to be another attack. Actually, it was just the Japanese extracting their wounded. And after that kind of died down midday, a veteran recalled leaving Pinner as the Japanese retreated, and horrible beyond description. There were dismembered bodies everywhere because the Japanese had just thrown so many men at this. And the guys were having to tread over body parts basically to secure the hill back up at the bottom. It's insanity, and it's difficult to imagine. They had a short service to bury 20 members of the commando that were lost, and 4 then returned back to 170 to plan the defence of the attack that they knew now was going to come on 170.
And just to interrupt there, because while you were taking a breath there, Simon Massey is asking, at this point, what is there in the way of air support, and how, what is there in of armored support? Where are both of those elements at this stage?
Yeah, so they are not near Pinner, basically. They are near 170, and we'll be coming on to that. We've got 3 Shermans from the 19th Lancers. We've got air support from the RAF and the US Air Force as well. But they're focused around the biggest hill, which is Brighton, and the attack at Pinner came at a pretty much short notice. And it's you're talking to get that communication out and back and move all that air support across in a matter of hours to this other hill that's kind of like up a jungle track and away, very difficult. And
unless you can give precise information, then could potentially do more harm than good, because recognizing targets, a target identification, with your own limited numbers, an airstrike comes in the wrong place, and it's made situation worse. So it's a tool. The Allies always had to use airstrikes like that wisely. And make sure you know what you're doing and you can put it in the right place. Otherwise, you're just going to make everything worse. So yeah, no, it's people have just to remind you, Lucy, that we've got several members of relatives of members of this action. You've got Richard. I think it was Richard Shaw, his name was, whose grandfather was in B Troop of 44 Commando watching. There's Darren watching it. It's wonderful. I love the idea of this. The live ability, people engaging, and they're talking about their relatives. It's a amazing bit of stuff. I'm really enjoying it.
That's awesome. I really like to hear from relatives as well, because I'm trying to pull together the pieces. There's been so little written about this that I'm anybody get in touch with me if you haven't already, and I'd love to hear your stories. So I guess let's move on to 170. So the Japanese by this point had Hill 170 under pretty much a constant bombardment, which is getting heavier day by day, and this brutally strained the nerves of the commandos. And towards the end of the 25th of January, and the rest of the 51st Indian Brigade began to arrive and reinforce the area, which is great. This included 3 Shermans of the 19th Lancers, 2 companies of Hyderabad's, and they attacked the smaller hills, Duns and Perth, and Melrose is the other hill there. And that was so steep that they actually had to scramble up on all 4s at points. So we're really talking about hills and not knowing what you're going to find when you're reaching the top of the hills, pretty nerve-wracking. But they were secured. So those small features were secured. By 6 o'clock on the 31st of January, the bombardment on Hill 170 had reached absolute ferocious intensity. 182 shells were counted as falling in the space of 30 minutes. And through the wooded northern end of the hill, the attack came, and the Japanese infantry threw themselves at 1 Commando and 4-2 Commando. The sheer numbers of men involved in the assault caused absolute chaos. If you move on to the next slide, we've got a picture of a chap who is very famous in this action, and that's Lieutenant George Arthur Noland, and he was awarded a posthumous Victoria Cross. His citation describes how he moved from trench to trench, distributing ammunition, completely exposing himself, throwing grenades at the enemy, and then in something which always sounds like something out of a movie to me, he supposedly grabs his Tommy gun from a casualty and spraying the Japanese with bullets before he's shot dead, because it's just 1 Commando and 4-2 Commando in this section, and the Japanese, as we know, they love to just throw all their men at something. So at this point, Noland's actions, they really inspired the men to cling on to the positions there, because if they lost that side of the hill, they're going to be in a whole lot more trouble. By mid-morning, the situation is getting desperate. Ammunition is running low, and 3 Commando Brigade, they're hanging on here in the face of seemingly endless waves of enemy troops. But as we often say, a day without a tank is a day wasted. And to the west, the Shermans of the 19th Lancers poured fire onto the attackers. This was some help, but as we mentioned before, the desperation and the ideology of the Japanese Imperial Army really was on full display during this battle. Yeah. Soldiers were brandishing a weapon known as piercing thunderbolt. I'm not going to even attempt to pronounce the Japanese name, but the translation is piercing thunderbolt. And this was a weapon, it was like a bamboo stick with a magnetic mine attached to the end, and it often resulted in the attacker's death. They basically hurled themselves forward with this stick with a mine on the end. And among the dead, Japanese soldiers were spotted wearing green berets, which they'd taken from previous encounters.
Yeah, Darren mentioned that earlier. That dastardly tactic there, and
it's just horrible. It's horrendous, and it's this psychological war. And on top of the fact your ammunition's running low, you're outnumbered. And it really is testament to the commanders that they held their nerve once again, especially after the pinner for 4-4 Commando. And this just went on and on and on. As the day wore on, it's getting hotter. And the Japanese assault is actually intensifying as the day goes on. From Pinner, which has now been secured, men from the Hyderabad, they were watching as the commandos put up this devastating fire on 170. And one veteran later said it was pure slaughter, because the commandos were defending this so well, this line, despite everything. The Japanese are just running at them, basically, as the moon rose on this, the Japanese finally withdrew, and the extent of their losses would really only become apparent in the daylight. And the commanders would discover the bodies of something like 350 to 400 Japanese soldiers at the foot of 170. And 1 Commando veteran, Bill Pirrie, he later recalled that there were so many bodies that they had to bury them with a bulldozer. And just to put it in context, 3 Commando Brigade lost 45 men. So
this is the thing, with hindsight now as military historians, we can understand that when the Japanese are doing their all-out, everybody charging things, it's actually like the analogy of the light bulb being brightest before it burns out. That means they're actually losing, isn't it? But when you're there, when you're a 21-year-old commando from, I don't know, Swansea or something, and there's all these Japanese guys hurling themselves at you, you don't know at that point, oh, well, that means they're losing now. That means they're kind of about to... You're in the intensity of it reaching this climax. But it does mean militarily the Japanese realize there's nothing. Yeah. If they're resorting to full frontal attacks with these, and Scott said those things you recall, they're also known as, what did he say they were? Lunge something. I've forgotten the bit he said. Lunge mines.
Lunge mines. Okay.
If you're using that kind of stuff, it's because you know you're kind of lost. But that, I don't want to kind of belittle what's happening to these commandos there who are not say, oh, well, this proves the Japanese are actually losing now. You know, I wouldn't dare say that to a commando's face because he would hit me in the balls. But yeah, I mean, it reaches this absolute climax there, and yeah, so I'll hand it back to you. Yeah, 350, 400 Japanese dead. I mean, that's staggering, isn't it?
It's staggering. I think that's a really good point that you make, Paul, is that, you know, when you're in the midst of it, I guess it just seems never ending. And you're thinking, how long can we hang on? How many more men have they got, you know? And in the morning to kind of see the extent of those losses, and to realize that, because for the guys in 3 Commando Brigade, they're losing casualties. You know, they're having trouble evacuating their wounded. They've got you know, there's sleeps from the Indian Navy are kind of ashore, and the casualty evacuation chain is difficult. It's complex. Had Indian stretcher bearers, you know, working incredibly hard and having to cross paddy fields, which are very exposed, you know, to get the wounded out. So for the commanders in that situation, must just have been horrendous. As you say, like, we've got hindsight, we can look back and see, wow, they were so outnumbered, but actually, you know, look at all this that was achieved. But at the time, of course, they don't know this. And there were many bravery awards that were won, you know, as a result of this. And so much of it, this photo here is a photo of Hill 170 after the battle. And for me, you know, it's not the clearest photo, it's not the best. No. But it gives you some idea, I guess, of the height of the hill. And you know, when the guys went back for the 60th anniversary, you know, they're all in their 80s, and some of them managed to climb it and get to the top, you know, which is testament to the strength of feeling they had about this. And it really was one of the fiercest fights in the whole Arakan region throughout the war. So of course, the objectives were achieved here. They kept 170. They took Kangaw, they captured it, and they managed to sever the road and actually take quite a few Japanese prisoners. By the 1st of February, the Marines, you know, they're mopping up and they're burying their dead, those that were left at Pinner and 170. And then, as I said, you know, they came back all those years later. Some of the veterans were lucky enough to go back. And, you know, Mountbatten cited the operation to capture Kangaw as an outstanding example of inter-service cooperation, and heaped absolute praise on 3 Commandos' defence of 170. The Japanese lost something like 2,000 men compared to the Allied casualties of about 600 throughout the whole course of the battle and all the operations. And it's just not received the same level of attention as Kohima or Imphal. I guess maybe, I don't really know why, actually. I often keep thinking about this. Why don't so many people know more about this action? Because it was so big. And then, yeah, just a picture there of the veterans returning and having a moment's sort of prayer on top of 170. But yeah, it's something
I think it's pretty simple why people don't know about it. Really, is that we keep sharing the same stories again and again and again, and and it doesn't mean that there's no value in understanding these stories. I mean, it took a long time. I would argue that even Imphal and Kohima weren't known about for a long time.
Yeah, true.
As I talked with James Holland, there has been a bit of a renaissance. People like James and Robert Lyman and all these other people writing about the Burma campaign. It's a little bit more in our consciousness, but it takes a long time for the fame to filter down, because about these other actions. And the thing is, we've had it before. You know, how many times are we going to see more, you know, Dam Busters movies and more, you know, these other stories? They do require more work. I mean, you know, for those watching, you know, the work you're not pulling this out of, like, if I wanted to invite someone on to do a presentation about, let's say, number 4 Commando in Normandy, they'd have about 30 different books to draw on, dozens and dozens of maps, dozens of you're going into much more uncharted territory to put together something like this, because there just isn't that much information out there. So that you know, we can only tell stories we know the background to, and if the background isn't there, how are we going to tell the story? So it's a long process. But
yeah, you're right. Yeah. And I heard you talking to James earlier in the week about, you know, is it time to kind of move on from the Forgotten Army, and kind of from that turn of phrase, and I think certainly in some respects, yes. But then when you look at something like Hill 170, not really. You know, it's tricky to kind of. I know certainly, you know, my granddad felt, yeah, was forgotten, and yet it was one of the most successful ops in Burma, and one of the most incredible when you look at everything combined. The lack of training, the old kit, being outnumbered. It is. And maybe it's because it's that little bit closer to the end of the war. I don't know. Maybe there's bigger things going on elsewhere, but it's certainly overlooked. Maybe that's the better way. Not forgotten, but overlooked.
I think it's come up on a lot of my World War II TV shows. This idea is that the public, I think, can only really, and myself, can only cope with one timeline at the same time. And we move along that high timeline from pivotal event to pivotal event. And sometimes there's something else going on that in the grand scheme of things appears to be bigger that draws the attention. And early 45, there is a lot happening in a lot of places around the world. We're crossing the Rhine, March 45, so there's a lot of things happening, and some things just kind of end up falling by the wayside. But as I said to James, I think it was James, I said that and Tony last night, the VJ Day coverage from the BBC last August, I thought was really, really good. Despite the fact there were no crowds there, and Sheridan Smith and all those others doing their singing and whatever was great, and Robert Lyman was on it. So I think Burma is coming back into the consciousness, but it's going to take a while for these, and I don't use the word smaller in the sense of the significant, but lesser well-known operations to come to light. And, we'll need the books, we'll need the documentary, we'll need the investigation. But, you're brilliant at what you do, and it's been really fascinating listening to this. And to have, as I said, to reinforce the fact we've got quite a lot of people watching this who have relatives who are out there, RAF and on the ground and commandos, and that we need to pay tribute to these people. And so let's round off with the significance of this. The in terms of the seizing that hill, seizing the town, holding the road. This is pivotal. The Arakan campaign was a vital campaign in the defeat of the Japanese in that theatre, wasn't it?
Yeah, it was. There were further amphibious landings, the 25th Indian Infantry Division, and they overland advance as well of the 82nd West African Division, and it made the Japanese position in the Arakan region just untenable. Basically, it gave that foothold to be able to press that home and press home to Rangoon, really. And the general withdrawal and to avoid the complete destruction of the 28th Japanese army was ordered, and many prisoners were taken. And without this action to capture Kangaw and to get that foot in the door in the region from the south, I don't know how much of that would have occurred. It would have probably occurred, but certainly a far greater cost and certainly a longer time.
And I think we'll end things fairly soon, but this idea that both Tony started and James Holland as well, this idea of we've learned how to move in these kind of fingered columns, this never put all our strength in one place, kind of spread the Germans out, turn the environment that they had been masters of into not knowing where we're coming from. And the whole 14th Army's push back in was on a kind of multi-probe, and the Chindit operations, the Merrill's Lord. We've learned how to do this now. We've learned how to take the Japanese and stretch their, by this point, the war limited resources even further, and kind of be confident in the jungle. I mean, Tony did specify last night he hasn't met any Chindits who liked the jungle or loved the jungle, but they had got to the point where they'd mastered it, possibly. And I think the Commandos, you could definitely agree, had by this point they have mastered it, and the discipline. Coming back to those events overnight there, the discipline of holding your own and keeping your nerve and not allowing all this psychological trickery to bring you down is a testament to their training and the doctrine and just their toughness.
I think that's the key thing for me. How should Kangaw be remembered? I think it's a real testament to the commando, to 3 Commando Brigade in their training, in what it takes to be a commando. I think, not to take away from other theatres and operations there, but it was put to a test in a different way, and it showed the reason why they train the way they do, and it showed what it takes to get that green beret, and it's something which perhaps we don't think about as much because of other conditions. You don't really think of the discipline side of things, but that was what was needed here. You think more of the action, strength, endurance. Well, all those things were needed, plus the discipline.
Yeah, and again, it's just unfortunate that some of the other commando actions, Walcheren and Normandy, they're closer to home. They're perhaps easier to kind of get to. The battlefield tours go there, easier to write about them, easier to get an understanding of the terrain and the objectives, and with what's going on in Myanmar right now, it's not going to be easy for historians to get there and research these places immediately. Hopefully, things will change again, and the difficulty of working with the different languages. And James Holland stressed that idea of how difficult it is to find Japanese archives and his sources, because they did fight to the last round, and so you want to give a balanced view of these things. Well, it's you're an uphill battle, but as people have said here, they want you to write a book about this, and
it's something I really want to do, and as you said, because the sources are so limited, I am really keen to any descendants to get in touch with me, because I want to tell those stories. And I think for me, it's the individual stories as much as the battle piece as a whole. Those are the stories that I want to tell, because I think in many ways, when we say the forgotten army, the way that I know certainly the veterans that my granddad knew, the way they felt forgotten was very personal. So that's what I want to get across in writing.
And did they feel a bit of jealousy towards the ETO guys within the commando associations? Was there a feel that those guys got a bit too much of the spotlight? And
I don't think
not because they'd be very proud of what their fellow commandos achieved, but perhaps a little bit feeling in the shadows slightly.
Maybe not jealousy, but certainly I think they just wanted the story told. I think that's it. So that's, I guess, what I'm trying to do is just to tell that story, keep telling it, and then I think if it was just known about, that's all, just the recognition of that's what we did, we were there, and so that's what we keep trying to do as historians, isn't it?
Yeah, well, we should be going for the new stories. Alas, some people just want to keep on telling the old stories. Again, but that's just I try on my channel and do popular stuff and less popular stuff. It's all about finding a balance, and Great Escape Week next week is kind of a popular kind of a week. Burma is less popular. You try and hit it with a variety of things. And if I just did completely niche stuff, no one would be drawn to me. So every now and then you throw in a dip into the special or something, because that brings people in. It's about balance. It's about people. I think if you give people new history, they will soak it up like a sponge. As there's particularly some Americans watching this week who would be the first to admit they don't know much about the Burma theater, because if you're an American, it's all about island hopping, understandably, because it was incredibly costly and incredibly vital what's happening there. But there is this other theater, and again, this idea that British have written about the British battles for the British market. Americans written about the American market, and Canada, and this idea of us moving forward where we all learn each other's sectors, I think is very vital as well. I hadn't really connected until James said it about the important, and Richard said it as well, the importance of the hump. I think of the hump as an American thing, flying suppliers in the Himalayas. I hadn't thought of it of the SOE helping to clear those areas to make sure the ground over which these aircraft are flying is secured. It's like, it's connecting what I thought were two separate stories into one story.
Yeah.
And that's as the jigsaw puzzle of history comes together, you realize each little bit helps you along the way with something else later. So
that's it. For sure.
Anyway, well, that's been absolutely extraordinary, Lucy. And given that you are more of a First World War person by trade, I mean, just incredible knowledge tonight. So well, you will have to promise to come back and do something else, either about Burma or something else in another theater of your choice. But brilliant stuff. So brilliant. So in terms of what's coming up, folks, of course we've got two shows tomorrow. So midday UK time, Tim Garung is coming on, a Gurkha, to talk about the Gurkhas, which I think is particularly extraordinary to have a guy who's actually from that unit to talk about that unit. And then later in the evening, the Robert Lyman, of course, will be coming on to talk about General Slim and Wingate and the leadership aspect. So as I've been reinforcing this week, the idea these shows kind of link together, big picture, small picture, to kind of provide a good overview of the Burma campaign, but it's definitely a theatre we're coming back to. There will definitely be a Burma week 2 at some point. And again, thanks to battlemaps.us for sponsoring this week. We need all those kind of that help we can get. I remind everybody, in the description below, you have the links to the other shows, links to Lucy on Twitter, what other projects Lucy's involved with, Patreon, the book lists, book recommended reading, things like that. Always check out the description. Thanks, Lucy. It's been brilliant.
Thank
And
you.
thanks, everybody, for watching. I will see you all again tomorrow for 2 shows. So this is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV saying enjoy your evening, and we'll see you again tomorrow. Thank you very much.